Welcome to Lecture 6.5, in which we will briefly go over fermentation, which gives us stuff like sourdough and beer, and alternative metabolic pathways, which is how lipids and proteins can be metabolized. Our learning objectives for this video are to discuss the fundamental difference between aerobic cellular respiration and fermentation, which is anaerobic, and to describe how lipids and proteins can enter the citric acid cycle. Remember that without oxygen, the electron transfer chain doesn't run, which means that all the NADH and FADH2 produced throughout glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, and citric acid cycle don't get oxidized, and ATP isn't produced. This leads to a buildup of NADH and not enough NAD+ to do any of these reactions. That's why low oxygen levels, which leads to high NADH levels, blocks pyruvate from undergoing pyruvate oxidation in the matrix. So what happens to pyruvate instead, and how do we get ATP without oxygen? Pyruvate instead undergoes fermentation. Under anaerobic conditions, which means without air, pyruvate will stay in the cytoplasm. An enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase converts pyruvate into lactate. Remember that dehydrogenases are named after the substrate that they take hydrogens from. Lactate dehydrogenase is able to take hydrogens from lactate and oxidize it into pyruvate, reducing NAD+ into NADH. However, it can also perform this reverse reaction, reducing pyruvate into lactate and oxidizing NADH into NAD+. This now creates a little bit more NAD+ that glycolysis can now use to produce more ATP. This is why when we exercise, there is a buildup of lactate or lactic acid in our muscles. However, more recent research shows that lactic acid is cleared pretty quickly from our muscles, so the muscle soreness you feel days after you exercise is probably more likely to be from your muscles tearing down and being built back up. The most important thing about fermentation is that its whole purpose is to create more NAD+ to allow glycolysis to make just a bit more ATP. Some microorganisms can also do alcohol fermentation. This process involves an enzyme called pyruvate decarboxylase, which literally just decarboxylates pyruvate and releases carbon dioxide. This creates a molecule called acetaldehyde, and another enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase reduces it into ethanol. This is a step that oxidizes NADH to regenerate NAD+. This process is how yeast produces bubbles that help bread rise, and how we get beer and other alcohols. Now let's talk a bit about how other nutrients can be broken down. We mentioned before that fats are great sources of energy storage. The fatty acids in fats are broken down in a process called beta oxidation. In this process, 2 carbons are removed from the fatty acid chain at a time and converted into acetyl-CoA. The acetyl-CoA can then go through the citric acid cycle. Remember that the citric acid cycle can only work under aerobic conditions, which is why we can only burn fat by doing aerobic exercise. Some amino acids can also enter glycolysis or the citric acid cycle, although this is more of a last resort. Alanine can be converted into pyruvate and then undergo pyruvate oxidation and go through the citric acid cycle. Glutamate can be converted into alpha-ketoglutarate, one of the molecules involved in the citric acid cycle, and there are a few other amino acids that can be converted into other molecules in the citric acid cycle and vice versa. In this video, we learned that under anaerobic conditions, pyruvate does not go into the matrix. Instead, it stays in the cytoplasm to undergo fermentation. The goal of fermentation is ultimately to produce more NAD+, allowing glycolysis to occur and produce ATP. Fats can be metabolized by undergoing beta oxidation, which removes 2 carbons at a time to produce acetyl-CoA. The acetyl-CoA can then enter the citric acid cycle. Amino acids can be metabolized by being converted into various molecules involved in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. That's it for cellular respiration. The next lecture will go over photosynthesis and how plants produce the carbohydrates that we eat and break down with cellular respiration. Thanks for watching.